Hey, you're watching Just Press Record on the Cultish Creative YouTube channel. I'm your host, Matt Ziegler, and on each episode, I invite not one, but two guests to join me for a conversation-style interview. These are smart, funny, usually a little eccentric, frequently a little weird, often very online friends of mine, and even if you don't understand what they have in common at first, just wait, because I've seen some common ground between them that I've been dying to ask them about, and just press record. The show practically named itself, seriously. So subscribe, like, comment below, and stick around at the end of the disclosures, disclaimers, and reminders, and, come find me, cultishcreative.com, at cultishcreative on Twitter, and by name on LinkedIn. Without further ado, throw your seatbelts on. Let's make it a record. Okay, I am pressing record now. Welcome to Just Press Record on the Cultish Creative YouTube channel. I'm your host, Matt Ziegler, reminding you to subscribe, like, comment, and all the things below. And today, we're talking movies. We're talking death. We're talking stories and tales and how they fit into the rest of our lives too. Two very special guests. My first is the host of the Watch with CT YouTube channel. And what's the CT stand for? It's not Connecticut, but as a former New England resident, I know he's as B-list as the state itself. It's not Siskel and T-Bert or some variation of the famous and dearly missed movie critics, although this CT does give as many as deeply analytical points as those two used to give a younger version of myself. That's very high praise. And hey, if the Reese he uses at the end of his name is worth the respect of my personal movie theater candy of choice, Reese's Pieces, if that's any indication, moviegoers, snack bar fans alike, say hello to the internet's busiest movie critic, CT Reese. Say hello.
Hey, how's it going? Yeah, that was pretty generous for something I've been doing for not very long, really. It's a new venture for me, but I've been certainly enjoying it. And
Quality.
as I want to say, though, it's the Reese's, not the Reese's Pieces. It's the shapes, the Reese's shapes. Whatever the shape of the season might be, that is the best Reese's candy. So it's Halloween. It's the pumpkin. I know there's a medal out there, and I'm on the search for it. I haven't seen it. I've seen the commercial, but that's the best Reese's.
That's a fantastic kit. Quality over quantity with the YouTube content. It's coming, but it's so friggin' good. I'm loving it. All right, My next guest, let's get the introduction so we can dive into this here. You know him for the book Wealth Actually. Maybe you know him for the podcast Wealth Actually. Maybe you know him for the YouTube channel Wealth Actually. And actually, besides being an advisor to family offices, trust estate consultant, all that aforementioned stuff, he's a huge movie nerd too. So the teaser for this episode might just be a Frazer, be very a Frazer, because the Alfred Hitchcock of directing the 1% on what to do with their money for maximum effort and impact. Grab a seat. The movie is starting. It's Frazer Rice, ladies and gentlemen. Say hello.
Anytime I'm compared to Hitchcock, that's great. It might be scary to have that applied to somebody's wealth, but we'll take it. By the way, my Reese's take would be to say that the dark horse in all of this are the Trader Joe's peanut butter dark chocolate peanut butter cups, which when you stick them in the freezer are absolute heaven.
The question before the first question is, are we all in agreement that most things like Reese's belong in the freezer first before being consumed?
Oh, yeah.
I don't get that far. Yeah, no, they go from the store to my mouth.
Store to mouth.
I'm far too impatient for any sort of extra steps. Yeah, no way.
All right. So I gathered you here because we go back and forth in real life and online about movies and this stuff. And I'm fascinated because this is more than just a side interest for both of you. And so when we talk about movies, we're talking about stories, and we're talking about stories formatted in a very particular way. I'm going to go to you, Frazer, first. What is it about a story in 85 or 90 minutes that's just so special? Why is that such a great snack wrapper?
Well, it's an interesting period of time because I think it's right at the peak of when your imagination / attention span starts to diverge. And so that 90 minutes is interesting. I think moviegoers and producers have kind of figured out that the 3-act structure is something that works well with the sort of understanding DNA of most people. And so when you take those format components and then you put it in the hands of people who are really intelligent and creative, and then use that to frame a story. It's sort of the universal format by which we all kind of access these types of things. And so it's interesting to see when people are able to play with that really well and both use the format and yet aren't constrained by the format to do something compelling. I think that's where we really get something that's pretty exciting.
I love the use the format, but not constrained by the format piece.
Yeah.
What about you, CT? What makes 90 minutes such a magical thing, or a little bit longer, a little bit shorter?
There's a practical answer to that as well as a just magical answer to that, I think, as well. And
Okay.
I'll try to get it correct, but it's my understanding that around 88 minutes, you would need another cam. Like, in other words, when you were sending these to theaters, you would need to send a whole other piece of film if you went along that over that 88 minutes. So you had to earn it. Like, if you wanted to have a longer movie, you had to earn that extra can. So there is a practical reason, I think, for that. But for some reason as well, I love a movie just under 100 minutes. Once you get beyond that, for me, again, you have to earn it. It has to be an exceptionally good movie, or has to have an exceptionally engaging story for me to continue to want to go along with it. And thankfully, there are plenty of movies that meet that definition. But when you're watching a lot of movies, very often I feel like that 80 to 100 minutes is the real sweet spot. But if I could be real picky, yeah, 85 to 90 is it's just perfect.
Frazer, I know you love the horror movie genre. I know you love all the fun things that come with it. You brought the 3-act structure. You want to give me just like an overview of how, like, the story structure in those movies before we even get into the variations? Just like, what's the general way to think about a horror movie?
So from a horror movie perspective, I think in the first act you sort of set up what the problem is. Then the second act, you have the main characters in slowly decreasing numbers trying to deal with that problem, and then the third act is when the one or two people end up solving that problem and then getting to some sort of resolution. And so I think that's generally, there are different types of ways to subvert those components so that people who come in expecting that are challenged. But in general, that's how it works. And I think that's how most movies work, because ultimately, when you're trying to get something made and you're trying to raise money for it, you have to sort of have a beginning, middle, and the end, and then make that understandable to a lot of people before they invest in it.
What's maybe not peak, because I don't want to pigeonhole you down to like just picking like one top horror movies, CT, that both earn their length and like represent this 3-act structure in a great way?
Well, you know what? It's you're always going to say what's of mind, right? So
Sure.
I just watched, because I want to do it for the channel, I watched this movie, Splinter. It was made in 2008, very low budget. And it's really funny you brought this up, because one of the things I thought was, wow, this really does that 3-act structure really well. Like, even if you're not familiar with it, you can tell where the breaks are. I'm just going to use it as an example. It's a movie where they get stuck in a gas station by this parasitic splinter type creature that turns people into zombies. But the whole first act, they're not even at the gas station. It's just entirely setting up the characters and really setting up the main gentleman to be kind of useless. So as the movie progresses, really the whole thing is his arc of becoming useful. As these horrible things are happening, he actually shows his use. And they do a really good job in that first act as well, like kind of sprinkling in, like, oh, he's a PhD biology student. Maybe and like he tries to study it first, and that's useless. But so it just does a really good job of taking you along his journey. And especially in a movie where I think we're tuned to think, oh, this is going to be the final girl. Like, we think, because his girlfriend she's pretty badass. Like, she's really take charge. And you think, oh yeah, she's going to be the leader of this movie. She's going to get them out of the situation. And she certainly helps. But I think that's how it kind of, it takes us along the journey we think we're going to see, but it subverts it by, instead of doing the final girl, we sort of have this nerdy guy who has to do some pretty horrible things in order to get out of the situation. So it really is about his journey. But it comes in under 90 minutes, so it really does it very well. I mean, I'm really trying to think of the last movie I watched that was truly long. I don't know the runtime on Jurassic Park, but whatever it is, it earned it. I'll leave that as the answer, because that's just a fantastic piece of my childhood that I can always revisit. So I'll go with Jurassic Park.
What about you, Frazer? Is there any movie or plot that comes to mind that you think nails the structure in the format, like the epitome in the genre?
I mean, to go to, one of the granddaddies of the genre, I think Halloween really does a good job of sort of saying act one, here's Michael Myers and where he came to be, and then sort of really developing the Laurie character and her friends, and sort of setting the stakes up in the first act. In the second act, you start seeing the chaos and then the Michael Myers part. And then the third act is Laurie versus Michael and how that's resolved. And it really, boom, 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 hits all those notes really well. And then and again, it comes in right at the timeline, almost exactly right. And you put that in the hands of what turns out to be a directorial master / really creative one in John Carpenter. And you get to see someone who, sort of takes the format, takes the tropes, defines the tropes in many ways, and then installs his own witch's brew onto it that makes it something that's been homaged, ripped off, used, enjoyed, venerated for generations to come.
I want to comment. We might need to come back and just do a John Carpenter or only Halloween special for Halloween. I'm realizing that in this conversation.
I'm ready.
You might get that invite. And in tune with that, you're going to correct me if I'm wrong, because I am bowing and I am not worthy status
More
before
like
both of you on this. Halloween 2, not John Carpenter?
Oh, there's a big backstory behind that.
That's the big break, right? Okay, wait. Let's do this.
He pulled away, and Rick Rosenthal took it over. And so this is a hot take. I like Halloween 2.
I'm a
almost
fan.
As much, if not more, than the original. Which
what year does this come out? When's Halloween
came
2?
out in 81. You can see Laurie Strode is a good 4 years older in person, even though
it's like a minute after. Doesn't
right.
it start right at the end?
4 years older. She probably had 6 more slashers under her belt at that point.
She has different hair too. So you're like, oh gosh, this doesn't work. They had to put a wig on her, I think, and because she was doing something else. But I love it. I think that's sort of, there's sort of a 1981 is the murderer's row, pun intended, of horror movies, is just the year when they just came at you over and over and over again, all different types, and some great ones, some not so great ones, but just a lot of them. And that one is firmly in the slasher subtext of horror movies. It's up there.
CT, on that one specifically, to the degree that I'm putting you completely on the spot for this,
Sure.
There's a big stylistic break when we talk about the director and the subversion of plot and the little twists and turns between those two movies. So if somebody's never seen these, like, just explain what a jarring difference it is.
Oh, that's so difficult for me to do, just because, growing up with these movies, and truthfully, I'm much like Frazer. I have a real soft spot in my heart for Halloween 2, even though I know it's not like a pop. And I think part of that is because
all three of us love this movie.
Yeah, we love Halloween 2.
So happy.
There are so many bad sequels that I like because they were on TV all the time when I was growing up. I feel like, because they were cheaper to license for, like, we could get, like, the Channel 9 and Channel 11 from New York. I know were like the two channels that played on Saturday movies all the time. So I would see all these crappy sequels that I love because I grew up with them. But I mean, you're going from he's stalking the whole town to really you're just focused in this hospital. And just from that alone, you're going from a kind of a wide open, anybody could be a victim, to a much more intimate location, I feel like. And for me, that's my favorite. I love small little movies where people have to find their way out of a specific spot. So it really just scratches that itch for me. But it is a very glaring difference. But the other thing is they up the gore, because really Halloween, there's not much actual gore shown. It's very much implied, a lot like Texas Chainsaw. It's what you think you saw, versus in Halloween 2, you get to see him like dunk her head in the boiling water. You see the face melt off. It's much more graphic. And that's the difference between the late 70s and going into the 80s. Everyone was one-upping one another. So you couldn't do a movie like Halloween anymore. People would think it was lame. There wasn't enough gore in it. Just in that short period of time, I feel like.
Just to add on to that, even though it had another 9 sequels afterward, I think Halloween 2 has a really satisfying ending. And oftentimes the sequels have trouble kind of figuring out how to resolve themselves. But this one, especially the third act of this, where it's really ramped up in the hospital, the pacing's actually really good in it. Even though that gets kind of sort of thrown out as a criticism of the first 2/3 of the movie, but the final third I think is really good, and then the ending is a satisfying ending, which sequels struggle with all the time, and in this one I think you just come out of it going, oh my gosh, this really turned out well.
I think that may be attributed to the fact that it was a sequel that didn't want to have any more sequels after it, so it allowed them to extend the story, versus we're making a sequel, there's something to milk here, we better leave it open, right?
It's
well,
like
that's an industry.
Cortez burning the boats. They're like, nope, we're going to stop it.
Yeah.
To the degree, Frazer, I'll ask you this first, to the degree that you know this, the sequels were still like kind of an emergent new idea at the time for the industry, I believe.
Well, so Halloween is sort of a peculiar one to sort of set out on that, because the whole theory behind that franchise was that it was going to be an anthology. And so the second one, the first one was such a surprise hit. They're like, oh my gosh, we got to figure out what to do with it and make more money with it. Then John Carpenter kind of took off. And then the third one, which is, that has its own lore because it doesn't have Michael Myers in it at all.
Breaks
was
off.
supposed to be the anthology component. It did poorly. And then the Accads, who are the producing family kind of behind it, and they said, okay, well, we're going back to the well, because that's what turns $5 million investments into $60 million profits. And then they said, okay, we're doing that and getting it going. It's rare that you get a really good anthology series. In fact, I can't really think of one off the top of my head, but oftentimes if you get something that strikes well early, the money beckons, and that sort of gets you going, and then you get that gore ramp up, and you have to do something to raise the stakes even further, and do what you can to kind of keep the characters in place that fans really enjoyed.
I'm just curious, do any anthologies or any broader series come to mind, CT, as favorites?
I mean, VHS is pretty good, and that's as anthology as you get, because everything's self-contained with all of its little vignettes in there. So, I mean, that's got to be a top. I mean, I'm not saying they're all good, but as far as quality and quantity and that sort of a package, that's probably as good as it gets.
How do you think, stick with me on just this topic for a second, CT, the concept of you have an initial hit and then you're going to come back for more, and how you're going to like perpetuate that thing. You said before about like, you got to earn it. You got to earn just the length of the movie. How do you earn a second, let alone like a third, in your perspective?
Well, the real answer is box office performance, right? I mean, that's at the end of the day, it's all about making money. So that's how you earn it. Truthfully, it has nothing to do with anything else. Let's be perfectly honest here. If there's no viability to make money from a sequel, it's not going to happen. Because think about it, there are a lot of movies that maybe had no business. Let's say Blair Witch Project, because hey, it's 25 years since that came out. They made that for a song, and it made a bundle. There was no real way to have a sequel from that. Yet they're rebooting the franchise. We're going to get another one. So, we've already had bad sequels, and we're gonna get more. Versus just let lightning in a bottle be lightning in a bottle sometimes, right?
Didn't we get a Blair Witch 2? There like,
oh yeah,
right, like a really atrocious.
We did. You can forget about it. It's fine.
I apparently have. So it speaks volumes. Frazer, the viability of the sequel piece and like proving it. So yeah, it's box office, but it's also, and I think this was part of what happened with Halloween with 2.
Character.
You look at what sells this thing, and then you look at what can I do to get people back to the movie theater.
Yeah, I mean, you can look at the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise as another example of that, where the first one had its own magic. It was a really creative premise, which I think both in a real, it's just one of those movies that, again, caught lightning in a bottle and just turned everything on its head. Then they're like, okay, this, Freddy Krueger is something we have to do more with. So then you get the second one, which is sort of, I guess it's called the gayest horror movie of all time, because they had the final guy, which was a subversion. And I think that movie has its charms too, which is good. 3, 2 didn't do great. And so when they went back to the well, New Line, which was the studio behind it, and they call that the studio that Freddy built, they said, okay, well, we're going back to the well that we think is going to work a little bit better. They brought Heather Langenkamp back, and they said, okay, that's somebody everybody loved. We have Freddy Krueger. We're going to make it darker, add some more humor into it a little bit, but really amp it up. Then after that, then you start sort of saying, okay, we've got this thing that is suddenly turning into a cartoon, and that's when you get the studio bosses, et cetera, and the screenplay by committee and so on. And I think you get the weaker efforts later on in the franchise. And ultimately, you have to get into sort of the mega or meta sort of conversion where New Nightmare, which is essentially what I would call the prequel to Scream, you go in and you have sort of this self-referential screenplay that harkens back to what you liked before, darken it up to get the fans back, darken it up to sort of reestablish the stakes again, and then take it off into another direction. And that's the tricky part. I mean, you have to raise the stakes. You have all these tropes that get built into the universe that you built, and you have to sort of enjoy them a little bit so that you don't alienate all of your fan base, but you've got to change it up a little bit, or else it gets boring, or you end up jumping the shark and it turns into something that you didn't like before. And those sort of Nightmare on Elm Street 4 and 5 and I guess 6, I kind of look at those and I just have very little use for them because they're cartoons. I don't find them scary, and you sort of they just took it to the nth degree, and you just, what am I doing here? And New Nightmare came back, and it did a really good job of getting back to what was really scary about the first one and trying to set the stage for something.
How do you feel about the tropes in the broader genre? So like you have your horror movie or slasher movie tropes,
right?
But then you have the tropes that you build into, and if I'm misusing the word, correct me, the ones that you build into your character.
In your character, sure. It's funny because in addition to loving horror, I also have a real soft spot for sitcoms, and it's the same sort of thing, right? And they call it the Flanderization, I believe is what they call it, of the characters.
Like
it's
Ned
where you just
Flanders?
yeah, like Ned Flanders.
Okay.
Yeah, you become a parody of yourself, essentially. And that's, I mean, how many times can you tell the same story or bring the same character in and try to take them along the same sort of arc, especially when you're trying to do it with a bad guy? Because this guy essentially has to get beaten every time, but not all the way. So, you run into similar problems where you kind of paint yourself into a corner and you, Frazer's point, you need to reinvent it in some sort of way to make it entertaining again. And New Nightmare did a really good job. I'm really glad you brought that up. I was fortunate enough to see that one in theaters, and that was what I wanted to see out of that character. Like when I was growing up, Freddy was scary. So yeah, when I then was able to actually visit those stories, because when I was a little kid, well, Matt, as I've told you, my parents weren't very cool with the R-rated movies, so I sort of had to venture on my own to like watch these. So I was a little bit older, and the first one he's scary, the second one he's pretty scary, like he rips right through the one dude directly. So, and then 3, 4, and 5, it really is a very different vibe. It's much more campy, and for me, that just wasn't the character. And I love campy movies, but it just doesn't work for that character for me, because this guy's scary, especially when you think of his like original story and
No
that
question.
background. To make him like someone to have fun with, it's kind of like, what was the 80s? They were doing whatever they wanted, but like that's not a character anybody really should be rooting for. But again, when you've got a lot of when you don't have the original creator of the characters having a lot of say in where those characters go, I think that happens pretty often.
Frazer, what do you think about the Flandersification or whatever that word actually is? The word we always use that says the same thing with like my game theory people is the cartoonification. That's the Ben Huntism we always use for this.
Right.
But I'm just curious, what do you think about that and the layers of tropes? I wanted your take on that too.
It's we talked about the 3-act structure as both, the format of choice, but also something that can be, you have to really work hard to break out of that to make something interesting. And as CT was saying, the characters can kind of get boxed in and it's not as interesting. I'll sort of reference Friday the 13th, my first horror movie. I mean, I think I saw Halloween 2 first, but my first official one, I think, was Friday the 13th, part 3. And that's one where you first see Jason with the hockey mask. You start really seeing that particular type of movie start to accelerate forward, and 4 kind of takes that to its nth degree. It has its own sort of Halloween 3 moment with number 5, where it doesn't know what to do with itself, and they had to try to come up with a non-Jason component. And then after that, you start building in 6, 7, 8, 9, Jason X, etc., where you basically got a zombie walking around and everybody's cheering. That's not a really scary movie to me. I mean, there's some things that are entertaining to that. I kind of like the practical effects, etc. But you have to fight the cartoonization of these characters in order to keep them real. And I think that that gets back to subverting the tropes, subverting the expectations, adding in something, which is why it's just really interesting. When I really appreciate it when a movie will take a swing on something and really subvert or change things around or do things differently, even if the result isn't that good. And I will point to the very latest Halloween sequel, where they brought in, there's a totally new character who becomes sort of wedded with Michael Myers' legend and becomes a killer himself. And I don't love that one per se, but I very much appreciate the swing that David Gordon Green and crew took in trying to do something really different with that character. And I think it just showed that screenplay by committee, they batted that away at least a little bit in putting that out there, potentially at the displeasure of the whole fan base.
CT, do you feel like, especially in horror, I think we kind of expect it, but in a different way in sci-fi, is horror one of the epitomes of like being able to take these tropes and play with them in this way? The best horror like finds the most interesting way to subvert these very almost transparent tropes.
I mean, yeah, just because that's essentially speaking the language, right? So horror fans, we basically have a language that we all speak that none of us really, I mean, we talk about it, but we don't talk about it, I don't think, that way necessarily. But we know as movies progress, when you see certain, like you can, whether it's Chekhov's gun or Chekhov's paper smasher, when you see something in the first act that's going to cause damage, you're like, that's going to come up later. Like we're all sort of on the same page. So it makes it easier to tell you that story in 90 minutes, because you don't have to bring everyone up to speed with every little bit of what's going on in the environment. It's kind of the exact opposite of what you might get in like a fantasy movie. Like the Lord of the Rings are so long because it has to tell you like all of the rules that exist in this entire world that has nothing to do with our world, versus in this world of our horror tropes, we know going in, if this is a slasher, it's going to follow the slasher tropes. Is this a creature feature? Okay, we'll follow some of those tropes. So yeah, I just think it's a way to talk the same language. And like, if you want to talk about somebody who actually does that really well, and it's why they're head of DC right now, it's James Gunn. I mean, he's been doing that since he Romeo and Juliet. And then he He wrote the Dawn of the Dead remake, which that's my favorite Zack Snyder movie. Maybe I don't know why they're warring. They should get back together and make a good movie. But from there, Slither, which is Night of the Creeps with Cronenberg body horror. Like
Yep.
he just knows how to take an old idea and just tweak it and reinvent it a little bit and make it new and fresh, which is I totally get why you'd want him in charge of your comic book franchise, because hopefully he's going to take those comic books and reinvent them in some way that they're more palatable, because those comic book movies are having a rough time right now. They're pretty expensive to make and they're not really delivering. So we'll see if he can do it. But I can see the logic in why they chose him, because that's sort of what he's done his whole career, is he's taking these stories we're familiar with and just, bringing us along for a new venture.
Frazer, do you have a favorite? Do you have like a James Gunn or somebody who you put in that, like, they so understand the expectations, the languaging with the audience?
I mean, Villeneuve with the Dune movies and Blade Runner 2049 before that, I think he can do no wrong. If I were DC, I would, raise an IPO and pay him whatever he wants. And just say, okay, look, your vision. He understands how to do a deep story. He knows the role of special effects. He knows arc. He has a multi-movie vision, etc. I just think you drop him in to a DC milieu, and a lot of the problems that I have with DC movies, in particular, with their power, their characters are too powerful. The stakes are way too high to be well represented. They get too CGI oriented. They repeat Batman's origin story every freaking movie, and you're like, okay, enough, move on. And I think Villeneuve he'd cut through all the nonsense. He was able to take Dune, which is just this mass of IP, and turn that into two pretty darn good movies, I thought. And Blade Runner 2049, I think, which is, I mean, you're playing with fire, going out, sort of taking on sequelization of one of sci-fi's all-time greats, and I just think I think it's a far better movie than the first one. Maybe another hot take, and I just think it builds on that universe and does something really smart and intelligent with it. That'd be the guy that I would that I'd put in charge.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that he made 2049 work without everyone getting upset is huge. I mean, you got to remember, people were debating whether Harrison Ford's character was even a replicant before that movie was made. So he just squashed all that. And to be able to just essentially kill a debate within a fan base like that, and everyone's cool with it because the movie was so darn good. He's one of the best out there right now. But unfortunately, a lot of times studios won't just do that, right? They won't just say, here's your blank check and just make an excellent movie. They always have to meddle. It's four quadrants. You're not hitting that one.
I think he can get whatever check he wants at this point.
I hope so. I hope so.
Let's talk about CT. I want to stick with you for a second on this one. Let's just talk about deaths, because I think body counts, deaths, either the impending death or the expectation of death in the horror genre, is a fascinating subcomponent, either to move the plot forward or as a penultimate or an ultimate event. It's just, what does death mean in this language?
Well, I mean, in these sorts of movies, it's just necessary to the story, isn't it? It's just part of the expectation. So really, I think when you're approaching these movies, you have to decide, are the deaths part of the story, or like, are we focusing on how the deaths occur, or are we focusing on how the deaths affect the other characters? And I think it's hard to do both. But it's easy. I think if you've got a good special effects guy, it's easier to do the first one, right? Just focus on the deaths, make the death. If you got Tom Savini, just make the deaths gnarly. Everyone will love that. But if not, then you really have to have good characters, which is difficult to do. Well-written, well-acted characters, but it makes for a more powerful movie. I don't need to see the goriest deaths in the world if I can see how these deaths impact the characters that are still around. And I think a lot of times that can be far more powerful than, a gory death.
Frazer, that specifically, how the death occurs relative to how the other characters perceive it. Feel free to go broader than horror on this, but I mean, because it's like Jaws, like not seeing the shark versus seeing the shark.
Yeah,
There's so many examples of this.
I was going to go into that. You go to movies to feel. If you go to a comedy, you want to laugh, you want to have a good time. If you want to, adventure movie, you can go see Raiders of the Lost Ark and, have your heart race that way. You go to horror movies, though, to be scared and to be scared slash entertained. I go to them also to see how people solve a problem with limited resources and do certain things. That's sort of the, how does Tom Savini pull the magic act of having an arrow go through a throat or something like that? But I one of the most effective scenes in horror movie history, I think general agreement around this, was the opening scene of When a Stranger Calls, when this is the second movie with the calls coming from inside the house type of thing. It's all shadows, it's all darkness. You have a babysitter there who is really trying to do well by the kids and protect them, and meanwhile you've got this psychopathic killer running loose in the house, as it turns out, and you, the audience member, see it, or you don't actually see it, but you know it's there, you see it coming, and there's this primordial urge either to help or to let them know or to be frightened, and insert yourself in her role in that sort of idea. And that, to me, that's when you're really working, is when you've got something like that happens. The actual killing can sometimes be the release or the payoff or the comic relief around what's happening there. And the really good directors, the really good storytellers in that, know how to turn that on and off and turn the knobs and ramp it up to 11, dial it back to 4. Then if things are slow, having a jump scare which sort of relates to the pacing, or you even have a pacing situation like in Blair Witch where it's sort of dun 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 dun, and then it ramps up a lot right at the very end, and you come out of it just completely chilled, and you sort of forget the fact that the first 3/4 of the movie you're going, what the hell's going on? These guys are running around the woods, and oh, it's creepy, whatever. The end is what made that movie happen. And to me, those are the different factors that sort of get into it and say, okay, the kill is the payoff at the end, and that can be manipulated in such a way that it brings the audience to where the director wants to go. The really good ones know how to play that like a really good marionette.
CT, any thoughts on like people who can go, or movies that either do one lane expertly, or I'm really interested if anybody can go back and forth the way Frazer just described?
Putting me on the spot, and I don't have any good ideas off the top of my head. Let me think real quick of like, I'm just trying to think of like things that I've recently seen, as opposed to trying to.
Yeah, this doesn't have to be best ever. Give me like
that's what I'm
recent
thinking.
memory.
Like, so this isn't the best ever, but as far as because the third act doesn't totally work for me. I rewatched The Strangers because Strangers Chapter 1 is coming out. So then I'll go. I haven't watched The Strangers since probably it came out, and I know I didn't watch it in like an environment that was conducive to like it being very scary. So I'll go revisit it, turn the lights off. And it did do a pretty good job, though, of building that tension, I thought, especially through the first 2 acts, when you sort of just get these little sights of the stranger characters and their masks as they make their way in the house, like destroying the cell phone. And then you can see the masked guy behind him, which is, I mean, that's straight from Halloween. That's ripped off from Halloween. We saw that all the way back in, what was it, 78. But again, you can do it again if it's done well. And I think, that's a good example of a movie that knew how to draw the tension out. Actually, my only problem with that movie is not any problem with the movie. I can't see Liv Tyler as anything other than Steven Tyler's daughter. So it just kind of like, it takes the immersion out for me, and it's not the movie's fault. And I feel like bad because I can't really fully get into the movie because of that. And I don't know if it's because I don't think the acting's bad. I think it's really just that Steven Tyler's kid. I watched her in music videos in the 90s. Like, it doesn't work from that perspective.
Well, that's why Scream and Psycho work so well, because you have the stars killed off in the first scene.
Yeah.
And so then at that point, all gloves are off
Right.
and anybody can go. And then you don't have that problem of overcasting. Sort of the issue with Dune 2, when Christopher Walken got on as the Emperor, and I'm going, uh-oh. And it turned out okay. But I was going, oh gosh, is he going to be saying, oh, fight us halfway through it? And, kind of wrecking would have been a kind of a nice journey for me. Didn't happen, so it was good.
Now, speaking of casting and stuff, see, I try to do the opposite. Like, so we have movies like Dune where they basically find all of the best, biggest names and somehow get them to work together, and it actually works. It's so difficult to do. So something that's, I think, I don't want to say it's easy to do. Maybe it's easier to do. Get a lot of really good character actors and let that be your cast. I just saw Last Stop in Yuma County, which I think did a pretty good job of that. It's set in the 70s. It's a total Coen Brothers, Tarantino type vibes, where everybody's stuck in a gas station waiting on the gas truck that's not going to come. There's a bag of money, and pretty much everyone has guns. So you can see when you have everyone kind of thrown into that kind of a situation, it can be very interesting. But what really made it work was the characters in it. The waitress character was, I can't remember her name. She was in House of the Devil, Ty West's House of the Devil. She starred in that. And she did really good in that. That's where I remember her from. But the bad guy, going to Batman, back to Batman, was Joe Chill. Back in Batman Begins, he killed Batman's parents. And if you look at his IMDb page, he's just a really good bad guy. I mean, he's played so many bad guy roles. And this movie gives him a chance to be a bad guy for more than 5 or 10 minutes. So it was really nice to just watch him chew up scenery. Like I just love movies that give character actors that don't generally get a chance to have a leading role or a monologue, just a couple of scenes to just chew up. I really enjoy that.
Frazer, what about this idea of casting and what you mentioned a minute ago too? The star power versus the really great character actors that just fill out a role. I'm almost thinking about Jamie Lee Curtis, like coming into the Halloween franchise and other things. Like,
yeah, I mean, so she just in her case, I mean, she was Janet Leigh's niece, I think, if that's right, and so that was her first major role, and she came in without expectations. I like the idea of character actors being in these roles because they come in with no expectations. When you have people who have actual star power, I don't know, they don't work great for me, generally speaking. And so I like to be surprised. I like to know that all bets are off. And then, occasionally when the star power is used to subvert that component, that's great. But horror movies in particular, because they're so relatively inexpensive to make, it gives people a chance. It gives young actors a chance to, command a vehicle. I mean, I'm thinking, Matt McConaughey and Renee Zellweger in one of the Texas Chainsaw sequels.
Oh yeah.
Jennifer Aniston was in she was in Leprechaun. And
classic.
it's a great way to see talent happen. And I'll throw a person, if I were to put a chip down on somebody who I think is, to me, unquestionably so talented, there's no way she can't be a star, is Mia Goth. And so she was in X and then Pearl, which is the sequel or prequel to X, and she's going to be starring in Maxine. She's been in a bunch of other things. I mean, she's just a star. And she's a really good actress, in my opinion. She's got sort of this very interesting look to her. I mean, she's very sexy and so on, but not in a sort of classic Brigitte Bardot type of way. And that the genre is great at introducing new talent. And it's always sort of a fun punchline to see, Jennifer Aniston disavow Leprechaun, even though it was her first vehicle before Friends. And but it's Jessica Biel. She was in a
Texas Chainsaw
sequel as well. And you see these folks, and you're like, yeah, you know what? Kevin Bacon. He was in Friday the 13th. That was the second. He was great. I mean, great in a relative sense. It's just interesting to see them there. I just enjoy seeing the young and interesting talent, and then the old character actors be able to sort of go in and sort of fill out the roles that they've carved out for themselves, and that sort of falls back into the tropism component. But casting directors really earn their stripes casting those things, and it's a part of the problem that the horror movie director has to solve, and it's really interesting to see how they solve it.
CT, this specifically because what I'm taking away from this tier is the star. Like the star can't be heavier in expectation than the trope and the piece that they're embodying. Is that fair to say?
You know what? I would never make a hard and fast rule like that. We can say it's a line that you have to think about crossing, and put it that way.
Okay.
But I actually, to Frazer's point of just seeing young people or people go back to horror, I do like seeing that. Like Kevin Bacon is a great example. He, no matter how big he gets and how many movies he does, he'll always go back to horror. Ethan Hawke will always make a horror movie, it seems like, which is pretty cool. And, as far as Mia Goth goes, if you haven't seen Infinity Pool, I would recommend that as well. You get to see a Skarsgård on a dog leash. So that's interesting. And I just want to throw my hat in that I am so excited for Maxine. I'm
giddy.
I have a personal story. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to step on. I have a personal Ty West story that I'm like, I got to get it out here. So 20-ish years ago, we were folding jeans together at the Diesel store in the King of Prussia Mall. He was making his first movie. He was editing and finishing up on his first movie, The Roost. And I was just some kid in college. And we worked a couple shifts together. And he absolutely had an effect on just opening my eyes to movies that I didn't know existed. Because really up until that point, my experience in horror was largely whatever I could see at the movie theater or mostly mainstream fare. And he kind of like, he would mention these other movies to me, whether a Japanese or Italian horror. And I would kind of like put them in the back of my head and wanted the opportunity to check it out. I'd go check it out. And it really set me down on a path that I don't know if I would have gone on had he not been around. So I've always been excited to see how his career would build. And now to see he's like kind of the man in horror right now, at least from a certain perspective, I'm like giddy over the whole thing. It's so freaking cool. And it just kind of shows you like how small the community really can be. Like he didn't go to USC or NYU. He went to Delaware. He's a guy that just wanted to make movies and was determined to make a movie. And that's what he did. And he's just been doing it ever since. And it's just awesome to see from that perspective, kind of getting to see not the genesis of it. Like I'm not even a side character in his story, but I'm just like a witness to him walking by on his way to greatness. It's pretty cool.
Frazer, was there anybody who growing up, was it all self-discovery, or did anybody else nod you towards, oh, you got to see this, oh, you got to see that?
So I'm old enough that I didn't really have, sort of the internet as a way to sort of access these things. So it was all VHS tapes. The most underrated thing in the horror genre is the front of a VHS box.
Absolutely.
And the artists, the picture that is chosen, the taglines, all of that's part of the weird sort of ethos of the subspecies here. That VH box, oftentimes when you were wandering around Blockbuster looking for something to rent, and you're going, oh, what is that? And an interesting comment on that, there's a movie called The Beast Within, which is, it's okay. Yeah. But the front of the box was this silhouette of something going on, looked like somebody's turning into something else. And they said, this is the scariest horror movie you'll ever see. You're going to have a heart attack. Shouldn't watch it. I was like, well, that means I want to watch it. So I'm way on board. And, so I ended up renting it, and I was like, oh, okay, great. And it was fine. But the front of the VHS box is the most underrated thing. And it's something that I don't know how you sort of reclaim that in the internet age. I mean, it really goes back to the 50s horror movie posters, which were cool and had double entendre and all these things going on that were sort of funny and zipped through on that. But that's really how I discovered it. I had friends who were fans, and so you'd hear about this or that movie, and you'd sort of have fun watching them and so on. But it really was the front of the VHS box when you're walking around Blockbuster, and the ones that did the best job selling, oftentimes were, they'd catch your eye, and you'd read the back of it and go, "Oh, this is terrific! I want in," and there we were.
Well, and you can't. When you commit, when you have the thing and you bring it home, you're gonna watch it.
Yeah,
it's not like a thumbnail on YouTube or something where I click and I'm like, yeah, this sucks. Like
No
off
question.
to the next thing. Like that time commitment is a huge thing.
That's right.
Yes. Which is why they made those VHS covers so misleading. They knew once you were out of there, you're committed.
Which there's a whole. In fact, actually, CT, you just reviewed. Well, it was a recent film. You did a non-spoiler review of it, which I love this segment because I can actually get a flair for something, get a taste of it, and then not have it ruined for me. I'm still curious. In fact, in this case, I'm extra curious. But you actually peeled apart like the cover. You actually made. I don't know if you remember saying this. This is recent. You were like, "There's a different biomask on the cover."
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah,
and I was like,
I forgot about that.
This is what I'm here for.
Yeah, New Life. So just to give everyone an idea. So when I go in to review these movies, I always do like an expectation section before I've seen the movie. I check out the trailer and marketing materials. So yeah, in the trailer, you got to see one character in just like your classic, it's in the trunk of your car. You throw it on the plastic yellow biosuit. And then on the poster, this other character has on this super advanced looking like sci-fi, almost like an astronaut. I was like, oh man, there's going to be some biological warfare going. No, not at all. And it was fine. Like it captured the vibes of the movie. So I was fine with it. And I think that's the key, right? Like you can have a slightly misleading VHS cover or poster if the movie delivers on the vibes that it's giving. I don't need to, I know I used the Alien poster as my go-to example when I was talking about it. Like that egg isn't an alien, but the egg that's in Alien is better. So it's fine. Like no one's going to get mad at that. So that's pretty rare though, when a movie has the misleading poster that actually, doesn't let you down. So, I mean, Roger Corman, may he rest in peace. He started so many careers, but how many of his movies had awesome covers and then you get it home and you're like, not quite there.
Frazer, do you have a favorite poster or a favorite VHS cover that you just think of the most fondly?
Wow. I always sort of remember Friday the 13th, Part 4, the final chapter, which had the hockey mask and the knife through
the eye or whatever. Right?
And they're like, "This is it. This is the final one." Of course, that in itself was extremely misleading, as it turns out. But that one I remember really is it's the first one I think of. Movie poster wise, I think the Halloweens and the Nightmare on Elm Streets all have their interesting. They're interesting for different reasons. The Halloween one's very simple. It doesn't really tell you much about the plot there at all. And then the Nightmare on Elm Street one is just, there's all sorts of things going on that you can't really tell what's happening in that either. You really would have to have gone into the movie to sort of understand what's going on there.
And even that one's a little misleading, that first Nightmare on Elm Street. It's a little, that scene's not in the movie.
Yeah, no, that's for sure.
Yeah.
What about you, CT? Any particular standout? You're surrounded by these. I love the backdrop.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, I love the Vice Press stuff over here. There's this UK company. I think it's Matt Carpenter is the artist that does most of this stuff. I really dig these alternate posters. I think he did these for like the 4Ks. I like simple, and I mentioned it before, but I'm just gonna say it again. Jurassic Park. It's such a simple poster, but it tells you everything you're going to see. Like all you need to see is that T-Rex head and that, in that orange silhouette. And for some reason, it just communicates everything you need to know about that movie. So I'm going to go with that one.
That's a fantastic choice. I want to stick with you for a second. You're making at least a career in the moment out of, or more than a hobby, out of the YouTube channel and telling these stories. Why do you think? Why do people care? Because they do care. I see some of these videos and the views they're getting. Why is this so important to talk about still? It's not just goofy movies, it's more.
Right. Yeah, well, and as I said, it's kind of a language that we all have, right? So I'm able to speak to this audience that I don't know. I've never met any of these people in my entire life. Yet I can speak about these movies without having to go into great detail because we're all speaking the same language. I can reference like Halloween, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street. If you can reference those movies when talking about new movies, and people instantly know exactly what you're talking about just because they're part of the vernacular. And really, it's something that horror's always done, and I think that's why I'm enjoying doing this, and I want to do this, is passing the stories along. I mean, our generation, we love the 80s, but if you look at the folks that made those movies, they loved the 50s. Or like John Carpenter, all he ever really wanted to do is make an awesome Western. Like he loved old Westerns. So every generation has these movies that they fall in love with and they worship in a way. And the interesting thing about doing this channel is I'm realizing that, like, oh, don't forget about the generation behind you. All these movies that I got to see in theaters in like the late 90s and the early 2000s, that's this generation's 80s in a lot of ways. And right now in the 2020s, I think we're having kind of a great resurgence of genre movies. I mentioned early on that a lot of these big tent poles are faltering. So rather than making a $300 million movie, make $10-30 million movies, make 20, $15 million movies. Like, do whatever it is. I think if you give more filmmakers the opportunity to tell their story, the cream rises to the top, right? I think we'll have more of an opportunity to see who's the next Scorsese, who's the next Spielberg, or who's the next Carpenter. So that's kind of why I'm enjoying this, at least for myself. It's really just to go back to these movies I enjoy, but then also to revisit some of these more recent movies through a different lens, and through this lens of continuing this horror tradition, or this tradition of storytelling, which, I mean, if you really want to get technical about it, it probably goes all the way back to the folk stories that people told when they frightened each other hundreds of years ago. I mean, how many of our monsters come from folk tales? So it really is something that is, for whatever reason, part of the human experience. It's horror. So whether we're doing it in a movie or a TV show or the written word or around a campfire, it's all about bringing these emotions up to the surface.
And Frazer, nothing in your day-to-day work or the things that you officially do seem to rhyme with this, but I actually think there's a huge formative thread here for you. I think,
yeah, I mean, story is everything, at least in my day job, which is sort of wealth management and tax planning and structuring and so on. First of all, the financial services industrial complex is a big sea of sameness. So if you're going to resonate anywhere, you have to deliver your message in a way that people will resonate with and remember. Added on to that, I focus more sort of at the upper end and dealing with multi-generational issues, oftentimes in ways that people don't think about before they come to me. And so I have to be able to communicate a little bit from a storytelling perspective what the risks are, what the opportunities are, what are the things they haven't seen yet that is distinguished maybe from some of the advice they may be getting from, let's call it, traditional wealth managers or brokers or things like that, where I in many ways, if you don't get past the math, and frankly, the math is the math, then you're not really building much anyway. And to get back into the idea that people go to the movies to feel, people are looking for advice, not just to, sort of have the most mathematically efficient outcome, but to supplement what they want to have in terms of a fuller life, to make sure that that their kids are taken care of, their different, their charities, their other constituencies, et cetera, are happening, and that type of thing. And if you don't do that with story, you're never going to make the connection with people in order to, A, get them to listen to you at all, and then B, actually implement the things that you're suggesting.
that's Really interesting in so many levels on the how to make it stand out. All right, I want to bring this to a close. I got some notes for us. I want to just tell you some of the fun things I wrote down on this because old habits die hard in industries where we have to take notes on all of our meetings. So I might as well use this for something good. So we started off talking about using the format, but not being constrained by the format. This is all going to fold right back into those summary points you just made at the very end here, but you got to use the format, not just be held, bound, and tortured by it. You still have to, you got to earn your keep. You got to earn the can, but you got to be able to raise money for it. I'm fascinated by this idea of the things we have to make work and actually make work in a marketable, real way. We talked about the crappy sequels, the versions on TV, the things that we build our love through, which is just as fans, how much that matters, that we learn these tropes, we learn these languages. We talked about the selling of anthologies, the how Halloween 3 bombs. And again, like going back to that 90 minutes, you have to earn your magic, even if that's new magic. So the audacity to create that second movie opens you up to new challenges. It opens up the cartoon risk. It opens up how are there new ways that I can enjoy the same tropes, but raise these stakes because I'm going to go out and do this thing again. I still can't say Flandersization, but I'm fascinated by this term. I'm going to try to say cartoonification and still wonder if I'm saying that one wrong. But all of it refers to this idea that the characters, as you iterate on these things, get boxed in. And the more they get boxed in, the less interesting they risk becoming, which is important no matter what line of work you in. We talked about death. We talked about how they occur as one aspect because there's the entertaining piece of the execution of the executing, and then there's how it impacts the survivors, all the people around them, how movies are here to get us to feel something. And with the horror movie genre, what we're really getting into is how that entertainment comes out in such a constrained place of story with limited resources. There's tons you can do with it, but you got to operate in those things. We talked about the expectations that characters and stars bring to the table. We talked about how that meshes with the expectations of the tropes, the expectations of the plot, the expectations of how you can take a nobody and have the most impactful role inside of this thing to help tell your story, or take a somebody and use that to subvert the expectations. We talked about the people who help us along the way. Your Ty West story is just absolutely legendary, folding jeans and getting movie tips, to now this Maxine movie coming out and being all over social media and all over the feeds. We talked about the criticality of, I don't even know if that's a word, the front of the VHS box as the most underrated thing. Maybe this is a future conversation, but just that concept of the embedded time of making the choice in the aisle and then being stuck with that choice and how that changes the time and patience for the IP you're about to consume. And then in the end, both of you said a version of this. Story is everything. You got to speak the language of the community that you're speaking it to. And that means you got to get past the math. You got to get back to the things that make you feel something. If that's not every industry, I don't friggin' know what is. CT Reese, tell the people where they can find your stuff.
Yeah, on YouTube, Watch with CT. Should be pretty simple to search for. I'm the only Watch with CT out there as far as I know. Yeah, horror, sci-fi, cult reviews. Trying to do new stuff and old stuff. We're only about 2 months in, so the whole thing's a work in progress. So like join me early and enjoy the journey with me.
Subscribe now so you can say you knew him when he can be your
back in the day. Like I'm doing with Ty West, right?
Like,
I knew that guy
Ty
back
West.
in the day.
That's the goal. Frazer, tell the people where they can find you.
So first thing, I listened to a few of CT's podcasts, and if you're a horror fan, definitely check it out because it's really cool, and he goes into some really good stuff. You can find me. I'm on Twitter at Frazer Rice. I have FrazerRice.com, and if you Google Wealth Actually, the book, the podcast, everything else that goes with that, you can find it there. And I lurk in other places, other podcasts and other things like that. But usually if you Google me, you can find some of my other projects as well.
Thank you both so much for joining me. You're watching Just Press Record on the Cultish Creative YouTube channel. We'll see you again soon.
Thanks.
Thanks for joining us. Like, comment, and hey, subscribe below to Cultish Creative on YouTube if you haven't already. As the good compliance people want me to remind you, Matt Ziegler, that's me, is a managing director at Sunpoint Investments. The opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Sunpoint Investments. No information on this podcast should be construed as investment advice. Securities discussed in the podcast may be holdings of clients of Sunpoint Investments. I hope you've been entertained. I hope you found this useful. I hope you talk to a professional before you try any of this stuff at home. And most of all, I hope you've subscribed. Be nice to each other out there. And don't forget, head over to cultishcreative.com and let's make curiosity a habit together. And I'm out.